Today we've got a crazy story of revenge on a stepbrother. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, a long time ago when I poisoned my employer's fish because he was mean. I remember a time when I played the best revenge at the time against an employer who was out to get me. It's certainly worth telling now. I'm 57-year-old male, and high school for me was at a time when things were as bad as they could be. I was 16 in the 70s and caught between the world of hard labor and my dream of getting an education. Going to school was my escape from a world of poverty, but obviously it wasn't entirely free and I needed a place to crash. The thing is, I was an orphan. I had just lost my dad and my mom was long gone before I could even pronounce my name. So money wasn't really forthcoming. And that's why I worked odd jobs doing whatever I could to scrape together enough for tuition and a place to stay. The oddest of the jobs I did was at a fish farm, run by a man named Brian. He owned quite a sizable piece of land and a reputation for being wicked. Of course, his farm was bringing more profits than his competitors because he paid workers like me next to nothing. There were long hours of work and the pay was just enough to get by. One thing to be thankful for was that he gave his workers a place to stay, and that was only because he needed us on standby, majorly seeing us as useful tools if we worked hard and stayed quiet. It wasn't a livable place as such. It was a shack, but it was free and enough to be called a home. Brian wasn't really someone who liked the idea of education. He had made it known to me on many occasions. He practically scoffed the day I told him my plans to finish school, saying, "Books won't feed you, learn to work harder." It didn't really matter much to me because I knew what I wanted. All I had to do was ensure I wasn't slacking off at work. The fish farm wasn't an easy task, by the way. I spent hours dragging about heavy buckets of feed and cleaning the water tanks under hot suns most days. It was honest labor and I had no alternative, so it was worth it. Back then, I knew I had to give it all it took, so no pain was going to stop me. I soon came to realize how much I'd regret working for Brian and that I'd have to get back at him for the wrong he did to me. We had been having a series of exams at school, but there was going to be the defining one, which marks whether we moved to a higher class or if we had to repeat a class. I was having trouble keeping up in the fish farm more than usual. My feet dragged, the buckets felt heavier than normal, and I messed up by dumping some fish food close to the tank's edge. Brian saw it right away. His mouth twisted into a sneer as his piercing eyes narrowed. "You're being lazy today," he growled. "What's the matter with you? You don't get paid to stand about if you can't keep up." I stumbled out an apology, attempting to clarify, "I was reading for a test. I swear, I'll make it up." "School? Once more with your school?" he cut in, his tone icy. "You think I care? You're here to work, not daydream." My money was deducted when payday arrived. A week's worth of work divided in half. With my heart thumping, I gazed at the coins in my hand. This was cruel, not just unfair. My school fees, books, and train fare to the testing location were all meant to be covered by that money. I spoke to him, my voice shaking with desperation and rage. "This is not possible. This isn't right. I worked the entire week." Brian gave an unimpressed shrug. "Maybe the next time, instead of wasting your energy on pointless things, you'll concentrate on your work." His words hit me like a slap. My pleas fell on deaf ears, and the realization sank in I wouldn't make it to the exam. I woke up that night and stared at the ceiling of the little cabin I lived in. The rage was intense, mingled with sorrow and helplessness. Although I was aware that I couldn't go back in time, I could ensure that Brian paid for what he'd done. I made up my mind. The gears of retaliation had already started turning. Something inside of me snapped the night I realized I wouldn't be able to take my exam. I had put in too much effort and endured too much, only to have it torn away by a man who only thought about himself. I knew better than Brian, who believed he was untouchable. I could act clever if he chose to play harshly. I sat on the edge of my cot and stared into the darkness when a thought came to me. I knew every timetable, every routine, every single detail about the fish farm like the back of my hand. I had learned more from weeks of arduous work than just how much a bucket weighs. Having studied the feeding and care of the fish, I was aware of how delicate the balance was. Fish would be deprived of oxygen and the water would get contaminated if there was too much food that rotted at the bottom of the tanks. This information in the wrong hands was enough to wreak havoc. My heart raced at the idea of reprisal. I was aware of the danger. If he caught me, he wouldn't hesitate to ruin what little future I had left. But the anger inside me was louder than my fear. He had set me back months of hard work, and even if I could retake the exam, I'd still not be where I'd planned to be at the time. The strategy came together in a flash. On my final night before heading off to boarding school, I would overfeed the fish. It would only take a few extra scoops in each tank, just enough to disrupt their diet and make the water unlivable. I would be miles away by the time someone noticed, and he wouldn't be able to prove it was me. For the next 2 days, I waited, planned, and watched. I was able to focus because of my fury. I promised myself that it would be the last time he scoffed at me or yelled an order. I kept my plan a secret, telling no one. I went about my duties as normal, being cautious not to give anything away. As my last day on the farm drew closer, the nerves set in, but so did the resolve. I had waited until the farm was quiet and everyone had gone home. I was prepared to depart at morning with my luggage already packed and hidden by the side of the road. But I had one last thing to do before I could leave. The dim light caused slight ripples on the surfaces of the fish tanks that towered ahead. The big containers of fish food were kept in the feeding area, and I crept in. I opened the first lid with trembling hands, and the first scent that greeted me was one of oil and grain. After exhausting workdays, the familiar smell used to make my stomach turn, but all I could smell was payback. My emotions spiked as I got closer to the final few tanks. In the back of my mind, fear warned me of the dangers, but it was soon drowned out by joy. I felt like I was in charge for once. I stood back and inhaled deeply as the last scoop struck the water. I had finished my assignment. The tanks didn't appear much different, but I was aware of the havoc I had just caused. If the fish were overfed, the water would become contaminated. Their delicate balance would be upset and the tanks would become unusable. It would be too late before anyone noticed. A peculiar peace swept over me as I crept back into the night after leaving the feeding area. Even though my pulse was pounding and my hands were shaking, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. As I walked the road, I didn't turn around. When I left tomorrow, Brian would be held accountable for his actions. When I left the small cabin I had lived in for months, the morning air was fresh. I felt light carrying my backpack, which had been packed the previous evening. It included all of my possessions, including books, clothing, and the little pennies I'd saved. The weight I'd been carrying for weeks, however, felt even lighter. The burden of frustration, rage, and helplessness had finally lifted. I felt a wave of relief and contentment. Without a question, what I had done was dangerous. I didn't regret it though. I had for once defended myself and regained some of the power that he had taken away from me. I experienced an odd calm as the train sped in the direction of the boarding school. I had the power to influence the future now, even though it was uncertain. What about Brian? At last, he had discovered that even the tiniest fish could defend themselves. After a few weeks, the boarding school routine started to take shape. It had been weird in the beginning, waking up without the fishy scent or Brian's commanding voice. Rather, the sound of the breakfast bell ringing, the chatting of classmates, and the quiet rustle of pages while I stayed up late studying. The air there felt different, lighter, as if I'd shed an invisible weight along with my old life. In the quiet moments, my mind often wandered back to the fish farm. I was curious to know Brian's reaction upon seeing the tanks that morning. I pictured the confusion, the disbelief, and finally the fury when he realized the extent of the damage. Knowing his temper, I imagined the workers enduring a storm of accusations and threats as he tried to figure out what had happened. His voice was so shrill and annoying that I could practically hear it, demanding answers that no one could provide. The pride flickered at the thought. What I did wasn't just an act of revenge, it was a stand against the cruelty and injustice I'd endured. I was aware of the dangers I had taken and the boundaries I'd crossed. I didn't make the decision to sabotage the farm lightly, but I stood by it. A man who believed he could steal everything from me forced me into a difficult situation when I was just a youngster. I took something back that evening. I couldn't deny the moral uncertainty of it all though. They weren't to blame for hurting the fish, and I hope the harm wasn't too great. However, when I considered how Brian had handled us, deducting my salary, dismissing my dreams, and robbed me of my exam opportunity, I was unable to feel remorse. If nothing else, I hoped it taught him that we earned respect and dignity, and that we weren't merely tools to be used and then thrown away. Not only did this event close one chapter of my life, but it also made me stronger for the next. The farm had shown me that I was stronger than I'd anticipated. Even though I knew the road ahead would not be simple, I had resisted an opponent who appeared untouchable, and I'd emerged from the battle unscathed. I vowed to myself as I gazed out the classroom window at the wide world beyond, I would continue to move forward despite any challenges. I had aspirations to pursue, and nothing at all would top me, definitely not Brian. I guess realistically what OP did was just about the main way to feel like they did get that revenge, but you kind of wish that there would be a revenge that could be done that wouldn't come at the cost of all of those fish's lives. I mean, don't get me wrong, I probably would never lose any sleep over it. I'm not really the kind of person that's gonna go and put a petition out for these fish at this fish farm, but in a way it did feel pretty unnecessary to sacrifice all those fish. I mean, what was stopping OP from just moving on and living their best life? Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is Realtor Saga. Some people's words do not count for anything, and that is one fact of life you have to hold close to your heart, because it will guide you in making informed decisions about whether to trust someone with the only property you have. In my case, I was not so informed about this principle till I had this realtor I trusted deal me a bad hand in the pack of cards he held underneath his sleeves. However, I was sure to pay him back a little bit. I first met Sutton the realtor through Joycelyn, a mutual acquaintance who wouldn't stop singing his praises. She would tell anyone with an earshot about his market expertise and how he was the go-to man for quick, profitable deals. At the time, I needed to sell my family home. It was a decision that weighed on me heavily. It was beginning to be more of a curse than a blessing because of all the bills that came with it. I never dreamed of having to manage 2 houses. My monthly earnings left me in a deficit for just one, but at the same time, letting go of years of memories wasn't easy. However, life had pushed me in a direction where I had no other choice. The first meeting with Sutton took place in the cozy corner of a cafe a couple of miles downtown in the city. When I first saw him, aside from the fact that I'd seen his pictures, I would have argued that the person before me was one of those Wall Street guys. I mean, who comes to a meeting in a shop cockily dressed in a sleek suit that probably costs more than my monthly mortgage? Well, if nobody did, Sutton most finely prided in it. Especially with the attention that he received immediately, he stepped into the cafe. It was like the entire room stopped to turn to him. Not that I blame them for stopping to stare though. Sutton was one of those people who had a persuasive charm, a smile that seemed to say, "I know what I'm doing," and a way of talking that made you feel like he had everything under control. He laid out his proposal with the finesse of a seasoned salesman, pointing at charts and spewing statistics. According to him, the market was in a downturn, an unpredictable monster ready to devour anyone who didn't make smart, quick decisions. The key is to sell now before things get worse, he emphasized, his eyes locking onto mine with a practiced intensity. Trust me, selling a bit below market value is your safest bet. Otherwise, you risk holding onto a property that won't move at all. Every word was delivered with such conviction that it drowned out the tiny voice inside of me urging caution. I nodded, wanting to believe him. Sutton was the expert after all, and I was just trying to do what was best. Sutton's pitch was relentless, layered with charts, data, and an air of absolute confidence. He walked me through graphs that detailed housing trends, each one marked with numbers that backed his claim. "The market's cooling off," he said, tracing a downward line with his finger. "Properties like yours aren't fetching what they used to. If you hold out for more, you might be waiting for a very long time." I could have told him that I was willing to wait it out, right? But where would that have left my pocket? I chose to believe his words. But even then, a flicker of doubt settled to the back of my mind, and boy did I wish I had heeded that warning. Every statement he made was peppered with industry jargon that made my head spin. Liquidity, market volatility, and price corrections were words he wielded with ease. The way Sutton spoke, it seemed foolish not to act quickly. His logic felt airtight, each point building on the last until I found myself nodding along without even realizing it. I pushed the doubt aside. I'd already been through so much trying to manage the house on my own. The idea of a quick, uncomplicated sale was appealing, especially with Sutton confidently steering the process. "You'll thank me later," he said with a smile, handing me the papers to sign. And even though my gut twisted a bit as I held the pen, I signed them. I told myself that Sutton was the expert, that he knew better than I did. After I signed off on the deal, he made it. Payment came almost immediately. I was super delighted. For one, it meant that I didn't have to worry about funds for a couple of months. That breathing space was enough for me to think I was stupid not to have done the sale earlier. A few weeks after the sale, I ran into Joycelyn at the local farmers market. She had always been a lively source of community news. Whatever was going on in the neighborhood was right at her fingertips. She just knew a lot, probably from being friends with almost everybody down to the attendants in stores. We exchanged pleasantries and she leaned in, eyes bright with excitement. "You wouldn't believe what I just heard," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "There's a house that just sold and flipped for nearly double the price in under a month. Can you imagine?" She was happy to inform me, probably because she believed that would strengthen my resolve to get into business with Sutton. For the sake of keeping private things private, I didn't tell her that the sale was done. My stomach tightened as I asked for more details. She described the property's location and the layout, the shaded front porch, the big bay windows, each word confirming the nagging fear that clawed at me. It was my house, the house I had sold for a fraction of its worth. "That can't be," I murmured, feeling a mix of shock and betrayal course through me. "Oh, it's true," Joycelyn continued, oblivious to my sudden silence. "The realtor who handled it made quite the profit." "Sutton, wasn't it?" I nodded absently, my mind racing back to our conversations. Sutton's smooth explanations, the charts, the urgent tone in his voice as he pushed for a quick sale. All of it felt like pieces of a puzzle snapping into place. If I had been paid what I was paid, that means there was more to the payment. It means I could have gotten more than I was paid. Sutton played me effortlessly. I left Joycelyn with a polite smile and promised to catch up later. The revelation was unsettling and I did not know how long I could pretend not to be sad before she figured out something was up with me. At the same time, I needed time and space to understand how and why Sutton would have exploited my trust and pad his pocket. That was not something you did unless you strongly believed that the person you were dealing with was deeply naive or could not do anything even if the truth of the whole thing came to light. I had a feeling he thought both in my case. The betrayal gnawed at me, refusing to fade. Just a few hours ago, the joy of being above my paycheck made my house feel a little more homely than usual. But the coldness that quickly washed over me was a testament to how easily my trust can be shattered. I couldn't shake the image of Sutton's confident smile as he sold me the idea that I was making the best decision. Now it felt like a mockery, a grin from someone who played me for a fool, knowing that I was none the wiser. I spent hours poring over every detail I could find. Real estate records, public data, anything that confirmed what Joycelyn had mentioned. The numbers were as painful as they were clear. My home had been flipped for almost double what Sutton had convinced me to accept. I replayed every moment I'd spent trusting him, every assurance he'd given me, and every reason he'd laid out for why I should sell now while I could. The sting of betrayal made it impossible to ignore the cold hard reality. He hadn't just misled me, he made me trust him and capitalized on my trust. Some part of me began to instantly want revenge. I thought about what I lost, and no, this wasn't me being greedy. He intentionally misled me to gain benefit for himself. It was him reaping where he had not sown and getting more profit than the actual owner of the house. That didn't seem fair to me in any way. The need for justice gripped me. Then, a part of me wondered if this was the same charisma that awarded him the luxury and fame that he got that made people like Joycelyn fawn over him repeatedly. It meant the reputation Sutton had built on charm was really just unethical practices and manipulation. I decided to check in with those who stayed close by. They would have heard if he had done something like this before. This was when I met with Matthew, a retired lawyer. I explained everything to him. Matthew nodded gravely when I finished. "I've seen this particular Sutton's tactics before," he said, folding his hands as if weighing the gravity of the situation. "This isn't the first time someone's been taken advantage of. He's just careful enough to avoid breaking the law outright." He said that the only way he knew we could fight him and get a percentage back from the excess sale Sutton had made on the house he sold was to report him to the board. So we worked together drafting a formal petition, detailing my story and including testimonies from others Matthew had contacted. Stories of Sutton's misleading practices and hidden profits. We sent it to the real estate licensing board. It took a while before they responded to our message, and during that period I wondered if there was something else ongoing that made it hard to reach out to us back. Eventually their response arrived. "If you're thinking it was an action of them suspending Sutton, well, think again. I ripped it open and read aloud. After a thorough review, we find there are no sufficient grounds to revoke Mr. Sutton's license. The actions reported, while concerning, do not violate existing regulations. We apologize for the discomfort you have received. He'd bent the rules, twisted them just enough to stay on the safe side, and there was nothing that could be done about it. He was going to walk away unscathed? This was when I knew then that I would need another approach. I needed to speak to Joycelyn. Joycelyn knew how to get through to many people in the neighborhood. She was friends with most of them. The fastest way to spread a story was to get her involved. So I spoke to her about what Sutton had done, reminding her of the interesting flip story she told me at the farmer's market. Immediately, she stepped up without hesitation. She began to spread the story of what had happened around, and I didn't have to tell her the part I wanted her to focus on. The more the rumors continued to fly around, the more people knew what was going on. People began to share whispers, and between small clicks, people began to question Sutton's work ethic, even in places he had not done anything unethical. One by one, his clients began pulling their listings, reluctant to associate with a tarnished name. After a while, when I'd put the entire episode behind me, I'd heard that Sutton had been unofficially blacklisted from the area, simply because no one wanted to risk their investments or reputation by dealing with him. Unfortunately, most smart sleazeballs like that are going to make sure that they're doing whatever they can just inside the scope of the law. Even though it's so filthy and disgusting it feels like it shouldn't be, what OP kind of pivoted to and what OP did is essentially what you have to do. You just make it known this guy is looking out for only one person and they are an utter sleazeball not worth doing any business with. Our next story is, my stepbrother took out the frustration of our parents' divorce on me. I made sure his life was basically heck on earth. I made my stepbrother's life a living heck, so much so that he regretted the day my father brought himself and my stepmother into our home. Now I know what you might be thinking. I must be a bad person for me to have even thought of doing something terrible to my brother, even though we weren't related by blood or anything. But let's take a step back and try to understand where everything all started. I, male 26, and my stepbrother, male 26, were officially introduced to one another some few years back, basically when we both were in high school. Now, let's do a little background on myself and my family. My father and I have been the only ones in my family for a very long time. Unfortunately for us, my mother, may her soul rest in peace, gave up the ghost when she brought me into this world. I never got to know my own mother, or even the love a mother would show to her child. My dad definitely did an amazing job in raising me all by himself, but there was no way that he could fill in the spaces only a mother could fill. We weren't in any financial constraints, and my father was able to provide for me in every possible way. I wasn't spoiled, I was just very much loved by the only parent I had. Now, for as much as the first 10 years of my life, my father decided that he wasn't going to take nor have another partner, and this was out of respect for his late wife, my dear mother, whom I never got to know. He was, however, convinced by some certain family members and friends alike that the loss of his wife didn't necessarily mean the loss of everything and anything romantic in his life. They assured and brought it to his attention that he too was worthy of having a second chance at loving and being loved again. I also tried to speak in however way that I could, as I would always tell my father that I would love to have a sibling of my own. After several years of being told what to do by others, my father decided to actually listen to them for once, and he put himself out on the dating scene again. Now, it didn't take long before my father found a match. I mean, this was to be expected, as he was quite the handsome fellow and any lady at all, would be very lucky to have him. This match of his would eventually turn out to be my stepmother. It didn't take long before they both got seriously involved with each other and eventually got married, and just like that, we had a new addition to our family. Now, for context on my stepbrother, he wasn't much talkative when I first met him, and I honestly respected that. I mean, I too wasn't much of a talkative myself. But then when I realized that I'd inadvertently gotten what I'd always wanted, a sibling, someone my age that I could hopefully relate with calmly on a daily basis, it took quite some time before we both opened up to each other. And thankfully we did, as things would have forever reigned awkwardly between the both of us. Now, after we had both gotten used to seeing each other on a daily basis, and after we'd both exchanged pleasantries a couple of times, things kicked off. And from then onwards, we both became thick as thieves. We were inseparable in the literal sense. We went everywhere together, we did almost everything together, and whenever we were outside, I would always try to make sure that people knew that he was my brother. I was just so happy to have him in my life at the time. Things were really looking good for our new family, until eventually they stopped looking good, and things just started to spiral from one moment leading to the next. Now that introductions are out of the way, let's get on to the main part of my story. My stepmother and my father were happily married for the better part of the first 5 or 6 years that they both were married, and then all of a sudden, everything just suddenly changed between the both of them. My father was not one to succumb to his emotions, as he'd always been a strong-willed man. However, after his union with my stepmother, I was beginning to notice some certain changes in his person, and one of them was easily resorting to getting anger, reacting to certain things that my stepmother would say to him and to various other things. Now, my father would eventually lose his grip, or rather lose control, and get physical with my stepmother. Now, although this was unintentional, she probably had it coming in my opinion, as she was always trying to get a reaction out of him. Now, the end result of this whole saga was my father and stepmother eventually getting a divorce. How does this entire story have to do with me getting revenge on my brother? Let's get right into it. Now, immediately after the divorce, my stepbrother changed completely. His attitude, his demeanor, his entire mood towards me shifted completely in the opposite direction. Instead of the usual affection we both had for each other, it immediately turned to hatred, and this day for one another. Well, such was the case on his side, by the way, because I had no reason to hate him, nor did I have any reason to feel any form of disgust or disdain towards him. Now, right after this, he did something that I never could have possibly imagined that he would do, which completely made me give up entirely on him and get revenge, which I deemed was exactly what he deserved. Fast forward a bit, right as we both were in college, seeing as we'd both gotten into college before the split happened, we both were in the same dorm room, but immediately after the split we had to take separate rooms, for reasons known only to him. I obviously had a problem with this, as I didn't see the problem in this, but with the kind of reaction and expression he was giving off at that time, I just felt like I shouldn't force him and just let him go. One would think that all of this were just tantrums, but no, it wasn't. A few weeks passed right after we resumed back to school, and I kept up my nonchalant attitude as a response to the same energy I was receiving, and my stepbrother took this the wrong way. He thought it fit to get a reaction out of me, just like his mother, and sabotage everything I'd been working so hard for the past few months. He did so by basically incriminating me with some certain illegal substances and then reporting to the appropriate authorities. Now, you might be wondering how I came to the conclusion that he did all of this? Well, it's quite simple actually. It's because my stepbrother is an idiot. Although he was in college, he was still as stupid as ever, as he came over to my place right as I was packing my things and tried to make a point by gloating and announcing his achievement right in front of my face. I had no idea at the time that he would have done something like that, for if I had foreknowledge of what he wanted to do, I would have taken appropriate measures in ensuring that I got all the necessary pieces of evidence I needed from the one responsible for my then expulsion from the university. But anyways, he did his little bit in my dorm room before leaving, grinning seriously and uncontrollably from ear to ear, while I just stood there and watched. A lot of things were running through my mind at that time, and the one that I really wanted to do to him was actually getting violently physical with him, but then it wasn't in my nature. I wasn't that kind of person. I was just like my father, only this time I chose not to get physical and let karma play its role. Now after that incident, I couldn't go back to school. I had to go back home. When my father heard the news, he threatened to get involved, but then I urged him not to, as he would definitely get what was coming for him sooner rather than later, and I was going to be there to watch it happen. And surely that time came much sooner than expected. Here comes the fun part of my story. A few months went by, and my father and I got a letter from my mother's parents, my maternal grandparents. They apparently wanted to leave behind all of what they were owned and were worth to my father. It came as a surprise to my father and an even more intense surprise to me. I had wealthy grandparents? Where were they all of our lives? Why haven't I seen or heard from them all this time? Did they not want to see their grandson? Lots of questions were on my mind at the time, but none triumphed over the one I seriously wanted to ask, and that was whether or not they hated or blamed me for my mother's death. I, however, couldn't ask them this, as before my father and I could head on right back to their estate, they had already passed. I couldn't get to see my mother, and I also couldn't get to see my grandparents. I didn't know how to feel. The only way my father could think of to console me at the time was basically handing everything over to me, as in his words, "It's what your mother would have wanted." I didn't know what to do or even how to go about this entire situation, but one thing that I knew for sure was that as long as my father was on my side and with me, nothing could possibly go wrong. And it didn't. For once in my entire life, nothing went wrong. And it didn't. For once in my entire life, nothing went wrong. Things were really going well for my father and myself, as we basically had to figure out how to properly manage the astronomical amount of assets we had inherited, or rather, that I had inherited. And the most important asset of all was the family-owned company left in my name. There was quite a lot to do, and seeing as I was young, I had all the time to settle down, learn the trade, and basically manage everything I owned. The company in question is a production company, and the one problem it was facing was a large shortage of workers. We needed to solve this sooner rather than later, as it was seriously affecting the company's progress. I suggested to the board of directors that we shift our range of recruitment to young and fresh graduates, as they would be beneficial to the company in the long run, and they were all in support. We moved on as planned, and during the recruitment process, I came across an all too familiar name. It was my stepbrother's. He was amongst our list of potential candidates. Now, I thought to myself, this is my chance. But then again, why reject his application when I can employ him and make his life at my company a living nightmare? Just the thought of this was enough of a get back for me. And that was what I did. He still has no idea who he's working for, nor does he know why he's being treated in such an inhumane manner, but the one thing he could surmise from the whole experience was that someone was definitely behind all of this. He has been working for my company for years now, and I've been enjoying every single day of my life since then. I've thought of revealing myself to him, but I think I prefer it this way. I wonder if this is like in a line of work where you kind of expect to just move up the ranks if you just work there long enough. The kind of thing where this person could work there for years and feel like, man, I'm just constantly being looked over for any kind of promotion no matter what I do. Little do they know who's pressing their thumb down, making sure that stays that way. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.